Mary Poppins Comes Back. Chapter 8. Balloons and Balloons.
"I wonder, Mary Poppins," said Mrs. Banks, hurrying into the nursery one morning, "if you will have time to do some shopping for me."
And she gave Mary Poppins a sweet nervous smile, as though she were uncertain what the answer would be. Mary Poppins turned from the fire where she was airing Annabel's clothes. "I might," she remarked, not very encouragingly.
"Oh, I see,"
said Mrs. Banks, and she looked more nervous than ever. "Or again, I might not," continued Mary Poppins, busily shaking out a woolen jacket and hanging it over the fire guard.
"Well, in case you did have time, here is the list, and here is a pound note, and if there is any change left over, you may spend it."
Mrs. Banks put the money on the chest of drawers. Mary Poppins said nothing. She just sniffed.
"Oh,"
said Mrs. Banks, suddenly remembering something.
"and the twins must walk today, Mary Poppins. Robertson A. sat down on the perambulator this morning. He mistook it for an armchair, so it will have to be mended. Can you manage without it and carry Arabelle?"
Mary Poppins opened her mouth and closed it again with a snap. "I," she remarked tartly, "can manage anything, and more, if I choose."
I know,"
said Mrs. Banks, edging toward the door.
"You are a treasure, a perfect treasure, an absolutely wonderful and altogether suitable treasure."
Her voice died away as she hurried down the stairs.
And yet, I sometimes wish she weren't,"
Mrs. Banks remarked to her great-grandmother's portrait as she dusted the drawing-room.
"She makes me feel small and silly, as though I were a little girl again, and I'm not."
Mrs. Banks tossed her head and flicked a speck of dust from the spotted cow on the mantelpiece.
"I'm a very important person, and the mother of 5 children. She forgets that."
And she went on with her work, thinking out all the things she would like to say to Mary Poppins, but knowing all the time that she would never dare. Mary Poppins put the list and the pound note into her bag, and in no time she had pinned on her hat and was hurrying out of the house with Annabel in her arms and Michael and Jane each holding a hand of a twin, following as quickly as they could. "Best foot forward, please," she remarked, turning sternly upon them. They quickened their pace, dragging the poor twins with a shuffling sound along the pavement. They forgot that John's arm and Barbara's were being pulled nearly out of their sockets. Their only thought was to keep up with Mary Poppins and see that she did not, and see what she did with the change from the pound note. 2 packets of candles, 4 pounds of rice, 3 of brown sugar, and 6 of castor, 2 tins of tomato soup, and a hearth brush and a pair of housemaid's gloves, half a stick of sealing wax, 1 bag of flour, 1 firelighter, 2 boxes of matches, 2 cauliflowers, and a bundle of rhubarb. Mary Poppins, hurrying into the first shop beyond the park, read out the list. The grocer, who was fat and bald and rather short of breath, took down the order as quickly as he could. 1 bag of housemaid's gloves, he wrote, nervously licking the wrong end of his blunt little pencil. "Flour, I said," Mary Poppins reminded him tartly. The grocer blushed as red as a mulberry. "Oh, I'm sorry, no offence meant, I'm sure. Lovely day, isn't it? Here's my mistake. 1 bag of flour." He hurriedly scribbled it down and added, 2 boxes of half brushes. "Matches!" snapped Mary Poppins. The grocer's hands trembled on his pad. "Oh, of course, it must be the pencil. It seems to write all the wrong things. I must get a new one. Matches, of course. And then you said—" He looked up nervously and then down again at his little stub of pencil. Mary Poppins unfolded the list, read it out again in an angry, impatient voice. "Sorry," said the grocer, as she came to the end, "but rhubarb's off." "Would damsons do?" "Certainly not. A packet of tapioca."
"Oh, no, Mary Poppins, not tapioca. We had that last week."
Michael reminded her. She glanced at him and then at the grocer, and by the look in her eye they both knew that there was no hope. Tapioca it would be. The grocer, blushing redder than ever, went away to get it.
"There won't be any change left if she goes on like this,"
said Jane, watching the pile of groceries being heaped upon the counter.
"She might have enough left over for a bag of acid drops, but that's all,"
said Michael mournfully as Mary Poppins took the pound note out of her bag. "Thank you," she said to the grocer, as the grocer handed her the change. "Thank you," he remarked politely, leaning his arms on the counter. He smiled at her in a manner that was meant to be pleasant and continued, "Keeps nice and fine, doesn't it? He spoke proudly, as though he himself had complete charge of the weather, and had made it fine for her on purpose. "We want rain," said Mary Poppins, snapping her mouth and her handbag at the same time. "That's all right," said the grocer hurriedly, trying not to offend her. "Rain's always pleasant." "Never!" retorted Mary Poppins, tossing Annabel into a more comfortable position on her arm. The grocer's face fell. Nothing he said was right. "I hope," he remarked, opening the door courteously for Mary Poppins, "that we shall be favoured with your further custom, madam." "Good day," Mary Poppins swept out. The grocer sighed. "Here," he said hurriedly, in a box near the door. "Take these. I meant no harm. Truly I didn't. I only wanted to oblige." Jane and Michael held out their hands. The grocer slipped 3 chocolate drops into Michael's and 2 into Jane's. "One for each of you, and one for the 2 little ones, and one for—" he nodded toward Mary Poppins' retreating figure. They thanked the grocer and hurried after Mary Poppins, munching their chocolate drops. "What's that you're eating?" she demanded, looking at the dark rim round Michael's mouth. "Chocolates. The grocer gave us 1 each, and 1 for you." He held out the last drop. It was very sticky. "Like his impudence," said Mary Poppins, but she took the chocolate drop and ate it in 2 bites as though she thoroughly enjoyed it. "Is there much change left?" inquired Michael anxiously. "There may be. That's as may be." She swept into the chemist and came out with a cake of soap, a mustard plaster, and a tube of toothpaste. Jane and Michael, waiting with the twins at the door, sighed heavily. The pound note, they knew, was disappearing fast. "She'll hardly have enough left over for the stamp, and even if she has, that won't be very interesting," said Jane. "Now to Mr. Tips," snapped Mary Poppins, swinging the chemist's package in her bag from one hand and holding Annabel tightly with the other. "But what can we buy there?" said Michael in despair, for there was not much jingle in Mary Poppins' purse. "Coal. 2 tons and a half," she said, hurrying ahead. "How much is coal?" £2 a ton. "But Mary Poppins, we can't buy that." Michael stared at her, appalled. "It will go on the bill." There was such a relief. This was such a relief to Jane and Michael that they bounded beside her, dragging John and Barbara behind them at a trot. "But is that all?" Michael asked when Mr. Tip and his coals had been left safely behind. "Cake shop," said Mary Poppins, examining her list and darting in at the dark door. Through the window they could see her pointing to a pile of macaroons. The assistant handed her a large bag. "She's bought a dozen at least," said Jane sadly. Usually the sight of anybody buying a macaroon filled them with delight, but today they wished and wished that there wasn't a macaroon in the world. "Now where?" demanded Michael, hopping from one leg to the other in his anxiety to know if there was any of the pound note left. He felt sure there couldn't be, and yet he hoped. "Home," said Mary Poppins. Their faces fell. There was no change after all, not even a penny, or Mary Poppins would surely have spent it. But Mary Poppins, as she dumped the bag of macaroons up on Annabel's chest and strode ahead, had such a look on her face that they did not dare to make any remark. They only knew that for once she had disappointed them, and they felt they could not forgive her. "But this isn't the way home," complained Michael, dragging his feet so that his toes scraped along the pavement. "Isn't the park on the way home, I'd like to know?" she demanded, turning fiercely upon him. "Yes, but there are more ways than one of going through a park," she remarked, and led them round to a side of it they had never seen before. The sun shone warmly down. The tall trees bowed over the railings and rustled their leaves. Up in the branches 2 sparrows were fighting over a piece of straw. A squirrel hopped along the stone balustrade and sat up on his hindquarters asking for nuts. But today these things did not matter. Jane and Michael were not interested. All they could think of was the fact that Mary Poppins had spent the whole pound note on unimportant things and had kept nothing over. Tired and disappointed, they trailed after her toward the gates. Over the entrance, a new one they had never seen before, spread a tall stone arch, splendidly carved with a lion and a unicorn, and beneath the arch sat an old woman, her face as gray as the stone itself, and withered and wrinkled as a walnut. On her little old knees she held a tray piled up with what looked like small colored strips of rubber, and above her head, tied firmly to the park railings, a cluster of bright balloons, bobbed and bounced and bounded. "Balloons! Balloons!" shouted Jane, and loosening her hands her hand from John's sticky fingers. She ran toward the old woman. Michael bounded after her, leaving Barbara alone and lost in the middle of the pavement. "Well, my dearie ducks," said the balloon woman in an old cracked voice. "What will you have? Take your choice and take your time." She leant forward and shook her tray in front of them. "We only came to look," Jane explained. "We've got no money." "What's the good of looking at a balloon? You've got to feel a balloon. You've got to hold a balloon. You've got to know a balloon coming to look. What good will that do you?" The old woman's voice cracked like a little flame. She rocked herself on her stool. Jane and Michael stared at her helplessly. They knew she was speaking the truth, but what could they do? "When I was a girl," the old woman went on, "people really understood balloons. They didn't just come and look. They took, yes, they took. There wasn't a child that went through these gates without one. They wouldn't have insulted the balloon woman in those days by just looking and passing by." She bent her head back and gazed up at the bouncing balloons above her. "Ah, my loves and doves," she cried, "they don't understand you any more. Nobody but the old woman understands. You're old-fashioned now. Nobody wants you." And we will pause there.